I live alone in a converted barn across from an old farmhouse with a small dirt path that connects the two. The farm used to belong to my grandparents, but it was divided into two parts when they died. My mum's sister, my Aunt Claire, and my uncle Gary took the house with my cousin, who has since moved across state. My mum inherited the barn, which I rent from her. The whole area is susceptible to flooding, which made it near impossible to run the farm. Most of the animals have been gone for years now, with just one cow and a small chicken coop left. COVID hit us hard. We lost my aunt to the disease. That was pretty much the final nail in the coffin for the farm, since she was the one who did all the work while my uncle spent most of his time drinking. This led to a battle over the deed to the house. My aunt and uncle weren't married, so my mum insisted that the house was hers. I honestly couldn't tell you who was in the right, but we were all grieving, so no one was in the best state mentally. My uncle ended up selling the cow, which struck up a huge blowout between him and my mum, and eventually Gary agreed to move in with my cousin. When the lockdown measures were introduced, people were crying out for new homes, so my mum thought it would be a good idea to rent out the house. As I couldn't work or pay rent, it was decided that I'd look after the chickens until COVID was over. My new neighbour moved in almost right away. He was odd. Each morning as I tended the chickens, he'd stand at the back door of the farmhouse, slurping a cup of coffee as he watched me work, and then came the rain. The water filled the fields inch by inch, engulfing the area around the farm, leaving only an hourglass shape. There was a few feet of land left around each building, and the path was still clear enough that I could walk from the barn to the coop at the back of the farmhouse. The next morning as I collected the eggs, he was there again, staring at me. I felt like a prisoner being watched by a guard. He looked suspicious of me, and I definitely had my suspicions about him, but I thought I'd give him a peace offering. I mean, we were pretty much trapped now, so it was a given that he was going to be my only form of human interaction for a while. I couldn't take the eggs to the market, and there was no use letting them go off, so I held out a basket with half a dozen. He immediately rested his coffee on the side and reached for them. There was plenty of space on the handle for him to grab, but instead he brushed my hand, trying to play it off like an accident. He reached into the basket and pulled out 2 eggs. It creeped me out, but lockdown made people lonely, I suppose, so I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. "You can take more," I told him. "These will do, for now," he replied suggestively. I gave a nervous laugh and skipped away before it got weirder. Later that night, as I tried to pass excruciating boredom, I began to hear creaking noises around the barn. I didn't think much of it. Old barns tend to squeak, but the noise persisted as I tried to sleep. Eventually, though, I managed to drift off. That was until I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door slamming shut. I instantly thought of my neighbour. Country girls are tougher than they look, and not a chance in hell was I going to feel threatened in my own home by that creep. I reached for the baseball bat beside my bed and stormed to the door. Grabbing the handle, I pulled, but it was locked. It was a solid door with a pretty hefty lock, so no one was getting in without a key. Coming to my senses, I laughed and went back to bed. Morning rose and hunger set in. I slumped down to the kitchen and brewed some coffee as I started to prepare breakfast. I reached into the basket for 2 eggs, and as I cracked one into the pan, I came to a haunting realization. The basket was empty. I took 6 eggs at collection yesterday. My neighbour took 2, so there should be 2 left. My legs shook, both through fear and adrenaline. The authorities wouldn't be able to make it through the flood, so I'd have to take measures into my own hands. I left the barn and stormed up the path towards the farmhouse. I stepped up onto the porch, and before I had the chance to knock, I slipped, falling flat onto the wood. I tried to push myself up, but slipped again from the thick liquid that pooled beneath me. Holding my hand towards my face, I saw red. It was blood. I resisted the urge to scream, burying my mouth into my bicep. I began to inch back, tiptoeing to try not to make a sound. Looking around, I saw the blood trailing over to the chicken coop. I looked up to the heavens, praying for strength before advancing towards the hutch. There, piled up with their heads cut off, the chickens had all been killed. "Thanks for the eggs," a familiar unsettling voice croaked from behind me. I slowly turned to see my neighbour in his usual spot, casually leaning against the doorframe, coffee in hand. There was no need to hold in my scream anymore. I let out a distressing shriek, causing him to drop his mug. With the distraction, I ran. He followed after me. I got to the barn and closed the door, bolting it shut behind me. I felt another wave of fear as it hit me. He'd been in the barn before, and he managed to get into the coop without breaking it. He must have had a key. I ran up to my room and retrieved my bat and my phone as my neighbour pounded on the door as relentless as my heartbeat. I called my mum. "Mum, what keys did you give the new tenant?" I screamed. I don't know. What's wrong?" "Mum, did you give that psycho the key to the barn?" "No, Gary gave him the keys, but I told him to make sure he took the barn key off. What's going on?" she fretted, but I didn't have time to answer. I hung up and dialed my Uncle Gary to ask him the same question. The pounding stopped. There was a long vibration, followed by a fumbling sound emanating from the kitchen. As the sound stopped, the dial tone pierced my ears. I crept towards the kitchen, and like a scene from the most horrific slasher, my Uncle Gary stood, gripping a knife covered in blood. I shot to the front door and unbolted it, but before I had a chance to escape, I felt my hair being pulled back. I tried swinging the bat, but Gary just tore it out of my hands and tossed it to the ground before throwing me down. I panicked, thinking surely my fate was sealed, but then the door swung open. My neighbour stood in the doorway with the sun beaming behind him, illuminating him like a knight in shining armour. Reacting quickly, he picked up the discarded bat. Gary moved towards him, but he avoided the attack, stepping to the side and swiftly striking Gary in the temple. As my uncle fell down, my new hero grabbed me by the hand, and this time it was welcomed. He pulled me up and we both ran to the farmhouse. My neighbour called the police as I kept watch. They responded a lot faster than I was expecting, probably because half the world was on lockdown. From the window, I could see the red and blue lights reflecting off the water on the ground, but the police just stood at its border. It wasn't long after that my uncle emerged from the barn looking defeated. With his arms in the air, he began wading through the flood towards them, handing himself over. I'll be honest, I almost felt sorry for him. Looking back, I don't think he actually intended to hurt me, but with the state he was in, who knows what would have happened if my neighbour wasn't there. He was sentenced to 1 year for battery, and is now back living with my cousin, who I still keep in contact with. We have a restraining order on my Uncle Gary, but I do see him occasionally drifting through the background when I'm on Zoom with my cousin. He's apparently quit drinking and has gotten his life back on track, but I'm still not ready to forgive him just yet. Maybe one day I will. It's quite hard to blame him entirely. Grief can turn people into animals. I live on the top floor of a 6-story block of flats with my teenage son. I won't give you his name, or anybody else's, and you'll soon see why. Each floor has a door facing the elevator with a code needed to unlock it to gain access to the hallway. There's only 4 apartments to each floor, so we'd all usually leave our doors unlocked since we all knew each other quite well and would often just walk in unannounced. There's a girl who lives down the hall, we'll call her Jane, probably in her early 20s and stunningly beautiful. One night when my son was in bed, I was scrolling through some unsavoury websites when I came across an image of her. It felt too good to be true, but being the shameless scumbag that I am, I just had to click on it. It took me to a video of her, not doing anything explicit. She was just sat on the edge of her bed brushing her hair in black lace underwear. I've never really understood why people watch this kind of thing when there's so much more on the internet, but OnlyFans is full of people just doing nothing and getting a lot of attention from perverted men. I wouldn't normally waste my time, but I knew the girl and was just fascinated by it. The side panel showed more videos, all as mundane with nothing really going on. My friend, we'll call him Rick, lives across the hall with his daughter, and in the morning when she went to school, I went straight over to show Rick my discovery. We'd spoke about Jane a lot, so I was expecting him to be just as excited as I was, but he wasn't. In fact, he looked mortified, telling me I shouldn't be watching. But I thought if she didn't want people watching, she wouldn't be posting the videos on the internet. He calmed down eventually and we had a laugh about it before he told me he had work to do. He works from home, so I didn't get why he seemed in such a rush to get rid of me, but I had a job to go to as well, so I didn't think much of it. Coming back from work, I saw Jane in the hallway as she was on her way out. I honestly didn't know where to look. I didn't want to mention the videos, but I tried to strike up a conversation. "I'm late," she said. "I'll catch you later." She jogged off towards the elevator with water dripping from her hair to the floor. She'd obviously rushed to get ready for wherever she was going. But now she was on my mind. I told Rick I wouldn't watch anymore, but I think I was kidding myself. I opened up my laptop and fell down the rabbit hole. Each video was filmed from the same angle, pointing at her bed, which was framed perfectly, however she wasn't. There were often just glimpses of her, and never a time where she looked directly at the camera. I started feeling unsettled when I noticed the latest video, posted just the day before. Unlike the other videos though, this was of her bathroom. It was just her brushing her teeth. I watched in horror as the phlegm and toothpaste flung out everywhere, thinking, why would she even film this? And then it started to sink in. She wouldn't. It was at that point that my son came home, so I immediately slammed the lid of the laptop shut. We had dinner and he went to his room right after, so I reopened the page to begin my investigation. I saw more trivial videos of Jane, seemingly unaware she was being filmed. And then, confirming my suspicions, a new video was posted, dating just a minute ago. Jane was out, so she couldn't have posted it. I took a deep breath as I clicked. It was Jane in the shower. If I saw it any earlier, I probably would have had a different reaction, but knowing what I did, it just made me feel sick. I didn't know what to do or what to think, but I instinctively thought of Rick. Enraged, I marched over to his apartment and bust the door open ready for the confrontation, but when I saw him having dinner with his daughter, I froze. "What's up?" he asked, looking worried. My eyes scanned around for evidence, but there wasn't anything to see. His computer was switched off, and they were halfway through the meal. In any state, I wasn't about to have this conversation in front of his daughter, so I came up with an excuse. "I was just wondering if you had any milk." "Sure," he said, and pulled out a full carton from the fridge. Looking into his eyes, I could tell it wasn't him, so I took the carton from him and bolted. I was up all night waiting for Jane to get back, trying to think of how I'd even go about telling her. I tried thinking about all the possible suspects as I continued watching the videos. I'd been there for that long that I didn't notice what time it was. Morning came and my son emerged from his room to make himself a bowl of cereal. I told him to take the milk back over to Rick's when he was done with it while I got ready for work. When I finished, I stood ready to go, but my son wasn't there. I went across the hallway. My son was stood there, shaking, startled from my entrance. "What's taking you so long?" I asked. "Nothing, I was just," he began, but I cut him off and hurried him out the door, worried about being late. I dropped him off at school and I went to work. Arriving back, I knocked on Jane's door, but she was out, so I went back home to see if any more videos had been posted. There was one. Again posted just a few minutes ago by the same user. It wasn't Jane's bathroom anymore, and it wasn't her bedroom. The walls were pink and there were teddy bears and dolls scattered around. I went pale when I realised it was Rick's daughter's room. Again my mind went to Rick. How could he film his own daughter, I thought as I watched her innocently playing with her toys. But of course, I was in denial. I knew who the pervert was. It was my own son. I confronted him right away. He tried to deny it at first, but then burst into tears as he admitted it. "I've confiscated every bit of technology he has, but I honestly don't know what to do about it now. Do I tell Rick, or Jane, or the police? Do I move away or just try to forget about it? I know my son needs help, but I just don't know what a good father is supposed to do in this situation. It's a hard thing to admit. I'm living with a monster." My fiancé Tom and I had just moved to the area, a quaint suburb with a mix of houses. As we began unloading boxes, I noticed an old woman on the porch of the house next door, casually rocking back and forth on her chair. I'd normally go over to introduce myself, but it was already getting pretty late and we needed to get everything inside. Besides, we were planning a small housewarming party at the weekend, so I planned to spend the next day inviting the neighbours. I smiled and waved and she waved back. I heard a man's voice shouting out to her. I couldn't tell what he said, but she replied, "I'll be with you soon." I span my head around to see Tom standing with a sheepish grin and an empty box, his contents spilled out onto the ground. I sighed and laughed and continued to help unload. We carried on unpacking late into the night to make sure everything was ready for the weekend. As I lined up some ornaments on the windowsill, I noticed the lights were on next door. The woman must have been close to 100, so I couldn't imagine her being up this late. It was then that I noticed a figure in the upstairs window, a silhouetted man, and whilst I couldn't make out any features, it looked like he was staring at me. I waved, but he didn't wave back. He just stood there awkwardly. I tried looking away, focusing on the ornaments, and when I was satisfied with their position, I swiftly closed the curtains. I told Tom what I'd just seen and he just laughed, telling me I'm being paranoid. Go see for yourself if you don't believe me, I laughed, knowing he was too much of a coward. He gave some excuse about not wanting to start off on the wrong foot and instead went up to bed. I briefly peeled the drapes open an inch to check on the situation, and sure enough, he was still there, still staring. I shrugged it off. Tom was right. There was no use in making an issue out of it just yet, so I followed him up to bed. The next day, while Tom was at work, I went to a few houses on the street to introduce myself and invite them over for some wine and snacks in the evening, saving the house next door for last. To be honest, I felt a little awkward going after what happened last night, and I knew they were too old for even a small gathering, but I couldn't not invite them. As I approached, the old woman was already sat out on her porch with the front door wide open. I introduced myself, and to my surprise, she was actually pretty normal. A little senile maybe, but friendly enough. I told her about the party, but before I even got a reply, I heard footsteps charging down the stairs and the front door slammed shut. It was official. This guy was a weirdo. Is that your husband? I asked politely. I got no response. She just continued rocking back and forth like I wasn't even there. The door slamming seemed to completely alter her personality. Well, we'll try to keep the noise down, I assured her as I began to inch away. She nodded. I'll be with him soon, she croaked. I was already a little creeped out, so I didn't want to question what she meant. I just smiled and then returned home to prepare for the party. Later that evening, the guests arrived. Wine flowed freely and the conversation was great. I felt a lot more at ease in the neighbourhood and have since become quite good friends with most of the people there, especially Judy, who lives in the house facing ours. She was loud though and kept insisting on turning the music up, but I didn't want to keep the neighbours up. Mrs. Morton's deaf as a post, Judy explained. She'll be passed out in front of the TV now with the volume on full. It's Mr. Morton I'm worried about, I retorted, and the room went dead. Everyone silently exchanged glances, shifting the mood entirely. I dreaded the explanation, but in my head I knew exactly what they were about to say. Judy looked me dead in the eyes. Mr. Morton died last year. I felt sick. Who shouted to her when we first arrived here? Who ran down the stairs and slammed the door shut? And who was in the window? My mind was rampant as I kept frantically questioning everybody, hoping someone would explain everything that had happened over the past couple of days, but no one could. By now the atmosphere had soured a little and guests started to leave. I could tell people were starting to feel a little uneasy, so I just laughed it off as Tom took my wine away, blaming the alcohol. As midnight approached, we said our farewells to the last of the guests. We sat snuggled up on the couch for a while, and Tom kissed me on the forehead before drifting off. I couldn't sleep. I removed his arm and began tidying up, if only to distract myself. Loading the glasses into the dishwasher, I saw the lights turn on next door. Fear crippled my body when I noticed the man in the window was back. Our eyes locked. I took a breath and ran to the sofa, shaking Tom, but he wouldn't wake. Panicked, I pulled out my phone, trembling as I dialed 911. It didn't take long for the police to arrive, but as they pulled up, the lights next door turned off. I waited anxiously for what felt like an eternity. 2 officers crept around the premises, dipping in and out of the house, one with a flashlight, the other muttering into his radio. The suspense was killing me. I tried to compose myself as one of the officers started towards my house. Before he had a chance to knock, I ran to open the door. He asked if I was the one who made the call and I said yes. Did you find him? I asked. The officer shook his head. I saw his nostrils flare as he obviously smelt the alcohol in my breath. Have you been drinking tonight, miss? I rolled my eyes. In short, desperate sentences, I told him everything that I'd seen and heard since we moved in. He just kept nodding, noting what I was saying, but not giving an indication of whether or not he believed me. He told me there was no evidence of anyone else in the house. I wouldn't accept it. I pleaded with him to look again, and that's when I noticed the ambulance parked behind his car. "Mrs. Morton?" I inquired. His face dropped to the floor and his chin sunk into his chest. My jaw dropped when I saw two paramedics emerging from next door, holding either end of a stretcher with what looked like a body covered in a white cloth. Mrs. Morton was dead. I couldn't believe it. The officer told me that it appears she passed peacefully while watching TV. He said there doesn't seem to be any suspicion surrounding her death, but since it was phoned in, they were still going to investigate what they can. As you can imagine, I didn't sleep that night. I'd managed to wake Tom up enough to get him into bed, but he was still pretty out of it, so couldn't do much to console me. I just lay there beside him, listening to his snores as I stared at the ceiling, counting the hours. Then, in the corner of my eye, through a gap in the curtain, I saw a light. I shot up, my eyes widening. Pure horror engulfed me as I threw back the drapes. There in the window, the silhouetted man stared. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Stood beside him, holding his hand, the ghostly outline of Mrs. Morton.